Ladies and gentlemen, students of all ages, welcome to Cycle 2015. This is actually not the 2015 cycle, though it is the latest in a long string of educational episodes started before me and hopefully to be continued long after me that are aimed at helping you and everyone we can possibly help with powerful ideas that can help them in their lives, all rooted in the freedom philosophy, which we think is central to having a happy and successful life on this planet. And I've been doing this for a long time, and I've met a lot of students, and I've talked to them before and after the ideas, and I've thought of many different ways of explaining what it is we do. And recently, given the phenomenal success of the Game of Thrones TV show, I thought of a new way to try to explain the heart of some very important concepts that I would really like everybody to think about and that I think can benefit them. But before we get to the Game of Thrones, I need to provide you with some context. And let me share a slideshow with you so we can do that. Okay, the technology works. Okay, so we're going to talk about the real Game of Thrones, not the TV show, but the real world. And in order to provide some context, we need to go back in time to when I was a boy, and this was the most popular television show on earth, the Roadrunner and Bugs Bunny cartoons. For anybody not familiar with this iconic character, this is Wile E. Coyote, and he was constantly blown up, shot, squashed, run over, dropped off cliffs. Any sort of bad thing you can imagine happened to this poor character. And he always survived to fight on another day and try to catch his dinner, which was the Roadrunner in the cartoon. The reason why this is important is that at the time, there were a lot of people who were very upset about this show and similar cartoons that were aimed at children and that were extremely violent. The worry was that children would be desensitized to violence, or that they would think that violence doesn't actually hurt. You can be squashed by a giant anvil, as Wile E. Coyote is about to be in this cartoon, and you'll be fine. You'll just get up, dust yourself off, soothe over the lumps, and nothing bad permanent will happen to you. Desensitizing children to violence was a great concern at the time. I was never particularly convinced by this. Of course, I was 8 years old at the time, and I thought it was just grand. Now, it occurs to me that today we have the Game of Thrones, and in a way, this is the ultimate answer. For people who were concerned that television shows were desensitizing people and making them think that violence was no big deal, we have a work of fiction that really emphasizes the grotesque and the brutal and the nasty in the world. We have lovely characters like our friend the King here, who is just about as nasty as they get. And I've even had friends tell me, oh, don't watch that show, it's just terrible, they do such awful things. It's horrible. And I've thought about that in the connection of Wile E. Coyote, whereas before the concern was that television violence was making light of the pain in the world and people wouldn't take it seriously. Now we have a show that just rubs the audience face in the violence and the ugliness potentially in the world, and people dislike it for the opposite reason. So I'm suggesting to you that this is actually a great service for people who don't understand how brutal the world can be. This show is a bit of an eye-opener, because the reality is that fiction never fully imitates life. There's nothing so horrible in this TV show that real people in the real world haven't done things just as horrible. You know, there are famous cases in the United States and in other countries where men have held women captive in their basements for decades. There's a case in the United States right now where somebody raped and murdered a 7-year-old little girl. I mean, there's horrible things that happen in the world, in the real world. And the Game of Thrones really has nothing on reality. It shows reality in a naked way that I think in some ways is useful. It debunks a myth, and particularly the myth that these people in charge, the kings and queens and all the beautiful ones on the thrones, are actually somehow nice and deserve to be there. Which brings me to my next point. Royal bastards. We call somebody unpleasant a bastard, though that's really an accident of birth and not their fault. And if they're really, really unpleasant, we call them a royal bastard. Well, why is that? Well, think about it. If you were one of those characters in the Game of Thrones, there's two prominent bastards, though there are many in the show. There's two. Jon Snow, who is noble and good and tries to help everybody and do the right thing, and Ramsay Snow, who is just about as evil and twisted and prone to torture and every nasty thing you can think of as they get. In reality, the Ramsay Snow type bastard is much more likely to happen. If you think back on the real medieval times in the world, you grow up with wealth and power and privilege, and you can pretty much do whatever you want and nobody can stop you. And at least if you're going to be king, there's some restraint. You need to pretend to be worthy of the throne. But if you're a royal bastard, nothing matters anyway. You're never going to be on the throne. So you might as well rape and loot and kill and do whatever you want in the world. And there's nothing and no one that can stop you. This is the reality of the world. People think about fairy tales of princes and princesses and kings and queens and all these lofty beings who do great deeds. But the reality is much more like the Game of Thrones. Now, this is all fiction, and it may seem like, well, why are you talking about this? Who cares? It's just a television show. Well, I'll tell you why I care, and I hope why you should care. And that is, as I keep saying, the reality is worse than the fiction. There is nothing the author of the Game of Thrones could invent that real people in our world haven't done in the past. And the people in power had the impunity to let loose on these baser instincts. Now here's my question to you, or here's the thing that I want you to think about. I'm suggesting to you that in medieval times, real kings and queens and princes and princesses were just as nasty as the royal bastards we see in the Game of Thrones. Now, that was history. What about today? Well, those people haven't gone away. And the people in power who hand power off to their offsprings or their chosen ones, or the people who fight their way to the top of the power structure, do you think those people are any more pure and lofty and high-minded than the ones back in the day in medieval times or in the imaginary Game of Thrones? Of course not. They have power, they have impunity. They continue to do what people with that immunity to consequences for their actions have always done. Rape and plunder and loot and do whatever they can possibly get away with. Now, you may think I'm exaggerating, or you may think this is still princes and queens in history. But I want to draw your attention to one more work of fiction. It's a Russian movie called Leviathan. You can see that on my presentation there. It's a beautifully shot film that I understand the Russian authorities are very unhappy about because it shows corruption in modern day Russia and what happens to the poor Slav who tries to fight against the evil corruption in the town that surrounds him. What they don't realize is that this isn't really particularly a dig at Russia. It's a dig at all power. Today, it's not just corruption in Russia. There's corruption in every country in the world. Even in the United States, even in the lofty Scandinavian countries, there are people in power who abuse power. And if you think they don't, just think about the context of the Game of Thrones. If you have that power and you control the police, you control the investigators, who can stop you? Who watches the watchers? Nobody does. And they do whatever they bloody well please. Fortunately, there is an alternative. In the TV show, this comes in the form of Khaleesi here, Daenerys Stormborn, and she has an idea. Now, I'm going to try to play a little bit of a clip for you here to explain Daenerys' idea. If that doesn't work, I've put the words up there for you to see. And let me see if I can get the technology right here. I'm going to share the screen. And we'll see what Daenerys has to say. Okay.
Lannister, Baratheon, Stark, Tyrell, they're all just spokes on a wheel. This one's on top, then that one's on top, and on it spins, crushing those on the ground. I'm not going to stop the wheel. I'm going to break the wheel.
Okay. I'm back. Now let me get back to my PowerPoint presentation. Okay, I find this thought very powerful, and I was surprised to see it in TV show. And I will confess, I have not read the books, so I don't know what's going to happen next, and I don't know whether Daenerys will succeed in smashing the wheel or not. But the idea is truly revolutionary. The idea is something that I hope you will think about and remember. She talks about the powers of her world, and you know, one's on top, the other one on top. It doesn't matter. Republicans, Democrats, it doesn't matter. They're all just spokes on the wheel. And instead of trying to grab control of the wheel and decide who's going to be on top, she says, I'm going to break the wheel. I love this idea. And the point that I'm trying to get at is this. Suppose that you're one of the Russian villagers dealing with Leviathan, the local Leviathan, or you're one of the peasants in the world of the Game of Thrones trying to deal with King Joffrey and all of his evil. Or wherever you are today, you look at the corruption in the world, you look at the problems in the world, you look at the people in power, the oligarchs, the wealthy, the connected, and they do whatever they want. And you'd have to be kind of dumb if it didn't occur to you, well, gee, what's the point? Why should I work hard? Why should I break my back being an honest toiler and saver if these guys, these psychopaths, can lie and cheat and steal and get whatever they want? I'd have to be stupid to just go to work at McDonald's and try to work my way to the top when I could lie and cheat and steal as well as those guys and have whatever I want. And okay, maybe that's not very nice, but the world isn't very nice. And these not very nice people will do it to me if I don't do it to them first. I present this thought because I think this is, in fact, the way a lot of people, consciously or not, end up making a fundamental choice in how they live their lives. They grow up as children in a la-la land, everything is wonderful. They come smack dab into confrontation with the reality of adulthood, and things are much uglier than they ever imagined they could be as children. And they're presented with a choice. What do I do in this violent, brutal, ugly, evil world that hurts me all the time? Well, do I become a victim? Hell no, I don't want to do that. Well, if I'm not going to be a victim, then I need to be one of the people on top. You're presented with a dilemma. You either become a victim or you become a victimizer. You either suffer or you become evil. Neither of these choices is very good. And this is what I'm trying to tell you today. There is an alternative. Daenerys here is telling us you don't have to be one of the spokes on the wheel to remain on top, and you don't have to be crushed by the wheel. We can smash the wheel. Now, I have no idea what she has planned, but I can tell you that in the real world, this is actually true. There is an alternative. You do not have to be evil to avoid being crushed by those who are evil. You do not have to be a victimizer to avoid being a victim. You do not have to be an overlord to be happy. And in fact, if you look at the outcome for people like Muammar Gaddafi and other dictators of great fame, the outcome hasn't been so great for them either. I'm not sure that those people are ever really happy. And there's one more caution I need to bring to your attention. If you do decide you're going to seize the wheel, you're going to become one of the powerful people so you don't get crushed by it, you remember what Lord Acton said. You probably have heard this. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. The context, though, was very specifically political. He says, I cannot accept your canon that we are to judge Pope and King unlike other men with a favorable presumption that they do no wrong. If there is any presumption, it is the other way, against the holders of power. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So if you imagine that you can somehow be one of the good guys who gets into power and uses that power to do good, remember what Lord Acton said. You seize that power, and that power's base, its root, is in coercion, and it does things to you, and it does things to those who wield it. Using fiction once again, one of the greatest illustrations of this concept, this danger, is the masterwork of J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings. In The Lord of the Rings, the One Ring of Power can give almost anybody the power to rule over others. And the great in the world can use this ring to basically subjugate the entire world. And there's a wonderful scene in the first book where Frodo Baggins, the honest hobbit who comes by this ring, he offers it to the great wizard Gandalf, telling Gandalf to take it to keep it safe or to use it to stop the evil powers walking in the world again. And Gandalf refuses. He says, no, with that power, I should have a power too great and terrible, and over me the ring would gain power still greater and more deadly. Yet the way to the ring is through my heart, by its pity for weakness, and the desire of strength to do good. Do not tempt me. I dare not take it, not even to keep it safe, unused. The wish to wield it would be too great for my strength. So this is my warning to those who think that they can grab the wheel, who can use it without becoming part of it, who think they can control it without crushing those who get in the way. In modern days, leaving fiction aside, we have a saying that politics is dirty business. And people want to get ahead. They want to change the world for the better. Well, you can't do that without getting your hands dirty. Or as Stalin says, you can't make omelets without breaking a few eggs. But those eggs are people, and they have rights. And it is wrong to break them because you have some higher goal in mind. So I want everybody to stop and think about what Gandalf says and about Daenerys' alternative. You do not have to become evil to fight evil, and you don't have to be a victim. There is an alternative. Now, what is the alternative in the real world? We don't have dragons to come and smash the wheel with, but we do have other kinds of power. And one common theme that you can see in what I've talked about in previous cycles, if you look at my recordings or other records, is that money is power. This is not a surprise. You've probably heard this said many times. Many people will agree money is power. But here's the point. Money is voluntary power. When I offer the money in my wallet to some person who has less money than I do to wash my car or fix my car or do whatever, I'm not coercing them. I'm not making them do anything they don't want to do. I'm giving them an opportunity that they think is better. And they accept the money in exchange for their labor or their goods or services, whatever it is. It's a purely voluntary transaction, unlike the kind of power that Daenerys is talking about or Lord Acton is talking about. That is the coercive power of government. That is the power to compel other people. As Gandalf is saying, this power to do good, even if it comes from an evil root, the coercive power to compel others, it can only lead to negative ends. And we shouldn't be tempted to seize that kind of power. Now, think about it. You know, I don't go around on the street and point a gun at the person in the store and say, give me those bananas and I'll give you this money. No, they want the money. They have lots of bananas. They'd rather have the money than bananas rotting on their shelf. So they happily take my money in exchange for the bananas. This is a voluntary transaction. And the beautiful thing is this happens millions and millions of times every day between people all over the world. It's voluntary, and both sides feel like they're winning. Nobody's being crushed by this. Nobody's on top on the wheel or underneath the wheel being smashed. Both sides are happier. I'm happier with the bananas. They're happier with the money. So unless you're a criminal, like politicians and other con artists and thieves, money comes from people who think they're better off giving it to you. This is really important. This means that you can accumulate money, which gives you power in your life and in the world to do things in a completely moral, ethical, and constructive way. And you deserve the money you get when you do this. The famous speaker Earl Nightingale once said that success will always be measured by the quality and quantity of the service you render. Money is a yardstick for measuring this service. Think about that. This is really profound. What this is saying is far from money being the root of all evil or money being something that only corrupt and nasty people are interested in. Money is a measure of your service to humanity. The more people that you make better off with whatever it is you offer in the global marketplace, the more money you get. Now, this of course doesn't count stealing or using the political system to enrich yourself. That's not free market. That's not capitalism. That's not voluntary exchange. That's just another form of criminal theft It's dressed up in nice hats and fancy uniforms and so on, but it's still theft. It's still a con. It's very different from voluntary transaction. So we have a lot more to say on this theme, and we're going to talk about wealth creation, wealth generation, entrepreneurship a lot in this seminar, as well as other aspects of freedom and living in the real world. But it's important to address this issue about money being a voluntary and therefore ethical form of power. Because if you have a bad attitude about money, if you think that money is the root of all evil, A, you make it very unlikely that you will get much of money in your life. Why would you want something that you don't think is good? And B, you'll limit your power to do good in the world in this voluntary way. But it's not all about money. And actually, this is not entirely a separate thought. Knowledge is also power. You can achieve a great deal in life and in the world with money, but also just with knowledge, with just ideas. And if you think of some of the really prominent entrepreneurs of our day, or world shakers of the modern world that we live in now, yeah, most of them became really rich. They made a lot of money. But what they started with was an idea. It was a really powerful idea, and knowledge of how to implement it, how to make it work. Steve Jobs, you know, one of the founders of Apple, and really the force who made Apple sometimes the largest company in the world right now by market capitalization. He was after money. He was definitely a for-profit kind of guy, but he started with an idea, with knowledge. Elon Musk, he was eBay, and now he's Tesla, and he's changing the world with the Elon Musk hyperlink and all these ideas. He's definitely an ideas guy, and this is the fountain of both his wealth and his power to get people to think about new and interesting and different ways of doing things. He's changing the world with the power of his knowledge. Larry Page and Sergey Brin there, if you don't know them, those are the founders of Google, or the ones most credited with getting Google going. And by the way, the Google slogan is "Don't be evil." Their whole notion is that, yes, we're a business, but we're going to follow ethical business practices. We're going to be so useful. We're going to create so much value for our users that we're going to deserve to make the money that we make. I think that's fantastic to have a slogan like that, "Don't be evil." That says it all of what I'm trying to communicate to you today. The other one, I'm not going to try to pronounce that correctly. I'm not Japanese, and we may have some people I might offend if I try. But this is the gentleman who's credited with starting what has become the Bitcoin phenomenon. And I'm sure he didn't do it single-handedly, and there are a lot of people to be given credit. But Bitcoin is another idea that is shaking the world. And there are people who will talk to us about Bitcoin during this cycle that have much more knowledge than I. So I won't get into it much, but I will say that it is, it's just an amazing phenomenon to see this idea that has governments literally shaking in their boots. I guess I can't say that. Let's say some government officials who wear boots are literally shaking in them, because this thing out there is threatening the foundation of their power, the control over money in the modern economy, and they can't stop it. They can't even arrest anybody to stop it because it's not one person's to control. There is no way to shut it off. I have concerns about Bitcoin. We'll get to that at some point later. That's not the point. The point is that knowledge is power. And guess what? Anybody can have knowledge. There's no monopoly on knowledge. There isn't, even despite patent offices and the recording industry of America, there's really no way to control knowledge. Anybody can think it up. Anybody can have it. Everybody can share it. And it can empower you in incredible ways. And by the way, as you can see by the examples of most of the people on this page, this power can lead to this power. Money, knowledge, knowledge, money. It's a beautiful loop. And notice in this loop, there's no coercion anywhere in here. Steve Jobs never pointed a gun at me and said, "You have to give me money and I'll give you a crappy computer instead." No, he gave me a beautiful computer that worked. It didn't give me the blue screen of death all the time. And I was happy to give him money, even though I knew that I could spend less somewhere else. I need my computer to work. Thank you very much, Steve Jobs, wherever you are today. Okay, we don't need to beat this to death. This is a very simple idea I'm trying to communicate to you. I want you to think about the Game of Thrones, not as a fantasy, not as a television show, but as a window on the realities of the ugly world that I admit does surround us. Now, I'm not saying the whole world is ugly. I am saying there is real ugliness in the world, and you need to confront it. You can't put your head in the sand. You can't imagine that it doesn't exist, because it does. It's out there. You have to deal with it. And you have to ask yourself, how am I going to deal with the Game of Thrones in the real world? Am I just going to let myself be crushed? Well, if your solution is to ignore it or pretend that it doesn't exist, if your solution is to say, no, there's no thing like that, the world is a wonderful place, there's no bad guys in the world, there's no real evil in the world. Of course, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but this is the actual choice that many people make. The reality of the ugliness that abounds in our world is so unpleasant to think about, many people simply don't. And I am encouraging you not to make that mistake, because you may, by some random chance, be able to live your entire life without getting smashed by the wheel when it rolls around. But the chances are that you will. If you don't think about what's happening in your world around you, you are more likely to be roadkill than happily living aside from all the dangers out there. But at the same time, I don't want you to think about this reality and be crushed emotionally, spiritually, inside yourself. I don't want you to become one of these people who decides, well, Leviathan is too great a monster for me to fight. You can't win. Nobody can win. So I might as well join the game. We have an expression in English, we say, if you can't beat them, join them. And I think this is sort of the number 2 main path that most people take. They either try to ignore the problem, imagine that the world is a more happy and problem-free place than it really is, or they go to the dark side, as the Star Wars saga teaches. They go to the dark side. They say, well, screw it. If I can't be good without being crushed, well, darn it, I'm going to embrace evil and I'm going to be on top. And I'm telling you that that is not only unnecessary, but that's not actually going to produce happiness. And apart from works of fiction where the people who embrace the dark side get their just desserts, I think you can look at the reality of the world today. It may seem for a while that somebody like Putin is on top and he's invulnerable to any bad things that could happen to him. But again, remember what happened to Muammar Gaddafi. It seemed for decades like nothing would ever topple this guy or bring back home to him his just rewards for some of the very nasty things that he did. And I'm certainly not saying he's the worst, but his ending, I think, is quite graphic. It's so graphic that I'm not even going to describe it. It's as bad as anything you can imagine, having watched the Game of Thrones. And this happens to somebody at the pinnacle of power, the leader of a country in the world. So you don't have to be crushed by the wheel. You don't have to embrace the wheel and become evil as part of the wheel. There is an alternative. You can seek power that is not corrupt, that is not based in coercion. You can seek power over your own life. You can exercise power that is voluntary power, that organizes a voluntary spirit of everybody you come into contact with and do business with, profit or non-profit business with. And you can do great things. You can achieve great heights. You can bring new ideas to the world. You can change the world, as some of those entrepreneurs that I mentioned have done and are doing. You can be part of that force which drags the whole rest of the species kicking and screaming into a better future. All you have to do is decide, and you can do this right now. You can do this listening to me right now. You can decide whether you're going to be crushed by the wheel, you're going to become part of the evil wheel, or you're going to step aside and you're going to seek your own power over yourself, your own life, based on the ethical premise that everybody is free and everybody has rights, including you. Just as you are a valuable person who deserves good things in your life, so does everybody else. And you're going to embrace the kind of power that maximizes that in your life and the lives of everybody around you. So those are my thoughts. Thank you very much. I spoke very quickly, but hopefully we'll get a transcript up at some point and the slides will help you to remember. But I also wanted to leave time for discussion. So hopefully, with the help of our handy-dandy stage hands here, we will have some discussions some questions to go over, and I'm happy to take your questions now. Okay, first question. Lobo, what can I do to find out how I can contribute to the world in a way that will mean gaining money, aka voluntary power? Well, You can listen to the rest of Cycle. We'll have lots of opportunities for you to think about exactly this. But the general idea is you want to offer value to the world. And whatever kind of value that is, whether that's in a job or creating a business or as an investment, speculation, as an author, as a singer, as a homemaker, whatever it is that you're doing, you want to add value to the world. And when you do that, good things happen. The easiest and most sort of simple recipe for doing this is, of course, in business. And to be successful in business, to start businesses, or to contribute to the growth of business is a very obvious way to add value to the world. And we have a very full schedule here where we'll be discussing this. In fact, we had a number of really interesting speakers come online. We had some last moment changes. So those of you who are just tuning in now, you may or may not have noticed that I had a talk scheduled called Business 101. We'll be directly addressing this question in that talk, but I'm not sure exactly when this talk will be. We had so many great speakers come online, I wanted to give them a chance. If everybody shows up as scheduled and we don't have time for that session, Business 101, I'll put my slides up in one of the discussion forums and I will discuss them later. But I have a feeling, because we have a lot of people all around the world, we've got more speakers, I think, than ever before, working in different time zones with different computer setups, and sometimes they're not reliable. So I have that Business 101 talk ready to go. And if not, I think several of our speakers will address that issue. And if all else fails, then I will post my slides and my thoughts in one or several of our discussion forums, and we can go from there. New question in Lobo: what would you say to someone who's been crushed by the wheel? This is actually a very good question and a very important one to think. And most of us have been hurt in some way, fashion, or form already. I assume that most of the audience here is students, though we open this up to students of all ages. So I know that not everyone is college age, but even college students have had their hearts broken, they've had their tricycles stolen, or they have had any number of other unfortunate mishaps in life. And so they're well aware of this lurking Leviathan that I'm trying to warn them about. And when you've been hurt, it's really hard to believe in the goodness of the world. It's really hard to think that there actually is an alternative. And frankly, we're human beings. You get hurt, natural response is you get mad. You want revenge. Most people do anyway. It's just natural. You get hurt, you want to hurt people back. This is what the 6-year-old does in the playground. It's unless we learn to become a little more civilized than that, it's the natural human response. But you don't have to respond by instinct. You don't have to respond like a brute. And you don't have to embrace the wheel. You don't have to choose to be one of those who crushes others. And that's what I'm saying is what most people do. The big step is to have a bit of a leap of faith. And you can trust me. You can say, oh, well, that Lobo seems sincere. He must know what he's talking about. I will believe him. That's a little bit hard. What I can say is that while Pollyanna optimism, believing that everything is rainbows and unicorns and balloons and teddy bears in the world, is not realistic, it is also not realistic to think that everything is dark and gloomy and dreadful and only evil triumphs in the world. That is simply not the case. It is just as unrealistic as the rainbows and unicorns. So if you maybe don't believe everything I'm saying now, I'm just a guy and I'm telling you what I think. But take this idea and go out there and research it. Don't just take my word for it. Go out there and look and try to take the hurt, set it aside for a moment, and look at the real world. And the trick here is don't just look at news organizations and their headlines, because they can sell more popcorn in movie theaters with scary stories, and they can sell more newspapers and more banner ads on their news websites if they focus on the negative in the world. That attracts attention. The reality is, if you go out into the blogosphere, you talk to people in the real world, if you open your eyes, you can see that good things do happen. I mean, just think about some of the examples from the entrepreneurs that I pointed out, and just think about the smartphone. In my iPhone or your Android or whatever phone you use, you have more power in your hand right now that you can hold up to your face than Captain Kirk had with his communicator in the Star Trek TV show, you know, again, back from when I was a boy. They made new movies, so maybe the younger generations has an idea. But back in the day, a communicator was a little device that you just used to talk to other people. Now we can do that, but we also can browse the web. We literally have the sum total of available human knowledge at our fingertips when we're talking to other people, or when we're interacting, or when we're working, or when we're playing. This is a phenomenal creative power that adds materially to the quality of our lives. And you have this now in your hands, or most people do. And if you don't have it yet, hopefully Business 101 Ideas will help you get there. Okay, somebody else asks, and by the way, I'm reading the questions in the online chat here, so I don't have names. Please don't take it personally if I don't acknowledge you in your question. But anyway, do go ahead and send in your questions. One of them is, do I have a hero who's experienced that kind of hurt but overcome it? I think it would be hard to actually find a real-life hero who hadn't experienced that kind of hurt. I haven't read as many biographies as I would like to. I've gotten so busy now with my real work that I don't have as much time to be the student of history that I would like to be. But you know, you look at somebody like Steve Jobs, and there was a great deal of unhappiness and even neuroses involved here, and those did not happen because of a perfectly happy childhood and young adult life. Or look at other famous people like Howard Hughes, who became, you know, multi-billionaire. He had a very unhappy past. Or some of the great inventors of history. Think of Thomas Edison. You know, he ended up going deaf and losing his ability to hear. There's a famous story of he used to go to the opera or to plays, and he had, after he invented the telegraph, or not he, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telegraph, but after the telegraph and the light and electricity was everywhere, the telegraph was everywhere, and Thomas Edison taught his wife how to do Morse code. They would go to the theater, and she would do Morse code on his lap. She would tap the words that were being spoken on stage on his leg, and he would understand the show. It's just one example of many of people overcoming adversity. So yes, in the real world, bad things really do happen, but somehow some people find a way to not let that crush them forever. I think, honestly, I'm a very optimistic person. I think, and we'll get into why I think this in some other sessions, but I think a lot of people out there, if not most people out there, actually have the seeds of greatness in them. It may seem a little too optimistic to say everybody can be great. Obviously, everybody can't be at the top. That's what it means to be at the top. But so many people are so crushed, so hurt, so maimed, and so underperforming in their own lives that it's actually not difficult to be excellent in our world. And I think most people have the seeds of what would now seem to be extraordinary greatness, if only they would see them, embrace them, and believe that they can actually do something with them. Oh, somebody's giving me names now. Alan Lynch says something in Latin. Oh no, participating in this chat is a good example. Response to this conversation. Well, there you go. We have new technologies now that are helping it. But really, if you think about any great hero that you've ever had in the real world and look back on their lives, you know, when did they not have any kind of adversity that they overcame? So I don't want to belittle tragedy. And if you've had some great pain or suffering in your life, I don't want to tell you, well, just get over it, grow up and stop crying already and go out there and be brave. That's not what I mean. And honestly, those experiences teach you powerful lessons that you shouldn't just ignore. You shouldn't forget, but you shouldn't let them stop you. There is, I cannot think of any great example from history or fiction or even religion that didn't go through great hardships. I mean, think about, you know, the carpenter of Nazareth, you know, hanging there on the cross, forgiving the sins of the world. The greatest moments of that story come after the greatest pains in that story. Or other people in the real world. I think of Samuel Clemens, who was also known as Mark Twain, who lost his daughter to encephalitis. I mean, and it's a horrible disease where the brain is slowly destroyed by these germs, and their mind goes slowly. It was before Alzheimer's became the boogeyman of the day. Any great creator I know has had these experiences, and some people argue that this is, this pain allows us to connect to others and is one of the ingredients in great art. All right, we have a new comment. The Life of John Bright, Trevelyan. Well, that's a new one to me. I don't know John Bright, but it brings to mind Jonathan Livingston Seagull. There's so many examples out there. The most important thing to stress is that this happens in the real world. You do not have to be crushed. And I've used many examples from fiction, ranging from The Lord of the Rings to the Game of Thrones. But those are just to illustrate them, because these are examples that I assume most people are familiar with. Whereas if I talk about Samuel Clemens, the writer, not everybody knows who Mark Twain was. By the way, he wrote Huckleberry Finn and other books like that, great American classics. Mark Lynn asks, what reading would I suggest on this topic? Actually, we should put together a bibliography. There are a lot of books on this. The books of Napoleon Hill are one way to start. Think and Grow Rich are one. Another less well-known, but I think equally powerful author is Dr. Wayne Dyer. He's no longer with us. He wrote a classic self-help book called Your Erroneous Zones. It's a bit of a clever title. At the time, erogenous zones were very sexy back in the 70s. By the way, in case you didn't know, the orgasm was discovered in 1979 by people in the Village in New York. Now, I'm being a little bit funny, but we talked about sexuality in ways that weren't approved of before the sexual revolution in the late 60s. And suddenly people were talking about things before, and erogenous zones that stimulated sexual interest were quite the topic of conversation a few decades ago. And so Wayne Dyer wrote a book called Your Erroneous Zones, which I think a lot of people bought for the wrong reason because of this. But it gave them great ideas. And your erroneous zones were simply a set of common mistakes in thinking, just like what we're talking about. This idea that you either have to be crushed by the wheel or become part of the wheel and crush others. It's a mistake. It's simply not true. You don't have to be evil. Like the Google model says, don't be evil. We can make money without being evil. This is real in the real world. And Wayne Dyer in his book, Your Erroneous Zones, pointed out a number of errors like this that hold people back. If you look at David Galan's talk last year, look at the recording on last cycle, in between sessions or whenever you have time, he also mentions the works of Earl Nightingale, who I quoted earlier. That's a wonderful talk. I think everybody should watch David's talk. It's just so human, so warm, so frank. And by the way, he will not be with us this time. Unfortunately, he had a conflict at the last moment. I do have a new speaker in his place, but this is a good reason to remind everybody to check the schedule, because there will be updates, and we may well get my Business 101 talk worked in there. While I'm making public service announcements here, I want to remind everybody that each one of these sessions has a separate link. So when we're done here, you'll need to click on the link for the next talk, which will be Tom Palmer, who's coming to us from Asia. Hopefully this time he will not be in the middle of a hurricane or tsunami or whatever it was that was blowing away the thatched roof over his head last time he talked with us. We're very much looking forward to Tom and hopefully a clearer connection. But remember, you'll need to click on the link for Tom's talk next when that's about to stop. And then after Tom, of course, we have Professor Ken Schooland from Hawaii Pacific University, also known to those of us who know and love him as Professor Fun. He's always got something powerful, thought-provoking, interesting, and generally amusing to present us with. So I want to encourage everybody after we're done to warm up those links, get ready for the next sessions, and we'll get right to those. All right, at this time, I have no further questions. I'm willing to take another one if anybody's got one. If not, there's no reason for me to yap just because I have the microphone. So I'll give you a minute, and then otherwise, I'll see you soon at the next talk. Liberty.me, Grace, do we have any more questions? No. Okay. Well, I'm going to thank Amazing Grace at the end of this show. She's our organizer, our main volunteer coordinator, but I've got 5 minutes, so I'm going to take one of them now to go ahead and thank her in advance. We would not be here today. We would not be having the wonderful show we have without Grace's wonderful help, because you know, I'm not on vacation. I'm still on the job here. I have not had the time to put this together, and Grace has done so much work to make this happen. So thank you, Grace, for helping us pull this together. We look forward to hearing from you in the rest of the show. And everybody else, thanks for listening in, and we'll see you soon for the rest of the show. Thank you, and goodbye.